Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Arkansas Ozarks. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1902, and the Ozark ridges were thick with pine and fog, a country so folded into itself that voices didn't carry far, and even the dogs barked in echoes. The Morrison property sat near an unmarked bend off Mill Creek Road, a two-story clapboard house whose windows faced the wrong direction. As one traveler once wrote, it was a place the mail riders hurried past, especially after sundown. The sisters, Catherine and Elise Morrison, were the last of their line, daughters of a reclusive landowner whose holdings stretched from Jasper to the upper Buffalo River. Locals said the old man, Elias Morrison, had made his fortune not in timber or cattle, but in something dug from the ground, something that shimmered black and burned blue at the edges when struck by light. Whether it was a vein of strange ore or something less natural, no one could say. In the county archives at Harrison, an 1898 deed transfer lists Morrison Estate, Parcel 7, Mill Creek Hollow, sealed with a shaky signature and witnessed by one Reverend Amos Tuttle. The Reverend's grandson, interviewed decades later, recalled that his grandfather spoke of that land as cursed, or at least unwilling. Before long, the sisters inherited not just the land but the debts, and what followed would blur the line between misfortune and madness. Catherine, the elder, was said to have been refined, educated for a time at a small seminary in Little Rock, while Elise was more fragile, nervous even in childhood. Neighbors described her as listening to things no one else could hear. By that spring, both women had retreated almost entirely indoors. The curtains remained drawn, smoke rose from the chimney at odd hours, and the only sign of life was the occasional lantern moving from room to room long after midnight. A traveling doctor named Henry Bales recorded in his journal that he was called there once for a nervous complaint, though he was never paid and never invited back. The surrounding region, as noted in early studies of the Ozark Mountains, was known for its deep hollows and limestone caverns, places where sound distorted and orientation failed. Locals sometimes spoke of the land itself producing moods in those who stayed too long. Whether by mineral fumes, isolation, or something unspoken, families in those hills often carried reputations for quiet breakdowns and whispered feuds. It was during the harvest month of 1902 that the first real alarm spread. A hired hand named Silas Redding, who'd been helping repair the Morrison barn roof, failed to return home. His tools were found neatly arranged on the porch, his pay envelope unopened. The constable's notes describe no sign of struggle, no prints in the soil, and an odor in the house not easily named. That was the beginning of what locals later called the hollowing. By midsummer of 1902, the Morrison house had acquired a reputation that extended beyond Mill Creek Hollow. Farmers passing the ridge swore they heard the sisters arguing, or perhaps chanting, in voices that rose and fell with no discernible rhythm. It's like the wind itself is speaking through them. One neighbor, Abigail Hart, recorded in her affidavit for the county clerk. She added that she never stayed long enough to see clearly, for the air felt thick, heavy, like it carried a weight too foul for living things. Inside, the sisters' routines had grown increasingly eccentric. Catherine spent hours at a writing desk. Though no one could read her script, the pages were filled with symbols and dates, often ending with a dash or a line crossed out with precise, vicious strokes. Elise, by contrast, wandered the halls whispering to the walls or staring for long minutes at corners where no furniture stood. A traveling salesman, Henry Whitlock, once claimed he glimpsed her staring into a darkened cupboard, as though the shadows were answering her. The sisters' inheritance had not been limited to the house and farmland. Among the estate's assets were a series of iron-bound chests, each locked with a different key, and several ledger books that once belonged to their father. County records later list them as Morrison et al., miscellaneous holdings, Parcel 7, but the content of these ledgers was enigmatic. One surviving page describes quantities of terra nigra and crystalline residue, items no local physician could identify, though chemists from Fayetteville speculated that some substance might have had psychoactive effects if inhaled over months. One notable report in the Harrison Gazette, dated September 1902, mentions that the sisters occasionally hired strangers for chores, only to release them within hours, citing unforeseen disturbances. It's in these entries that the first verifiable signs of disappearance appear. Redding was followed, though never formally located. Another laborer, James McAllister, vanished after transporting firewood into the back cellar. All that remained was his cart, neatly aligned with the door, and a small copper token he always carried, a token Catherine's own ledger mentions repeatedly. Some local scholars later attempted to contextualize these events using studies of the Ozark Mountains. The region's deep hollows, irregular topography, and isolated limestone caves often created acoustic anomalies. Echoes could mimic voices, and shifting fogs could distort perception, especially for those living entirely within these valleys. The Morrison sisters' unusual behaviors, some argue, might have been magnified by this environment, though first-hand accounts suggest that something far more deliberate, and perhaps intentional, occurred inside the walls of the Morrison estate. By October, the situation had escalated to attract official attention. Constable William Harding, a man familiar with the Ozark Hills, filed a report noting that he observed faint candlelight through every window at irregular hours, and a strong smell of something metallic. Harding attempted to speak with the sisters directly, though Catherine dismissed him with a curt gesture, and Elise simply stared at him, unblinking, before retreating into the shadows. Harding's testimony, preserved in county archives, includes the line, "It was as if the house itself recoiled from intrusion." Meanwhile, whispers in surrounding towns added layers of folklore to the unfolding events. One affidavit claims that the sisters spoke to unseen entities in the attic, while another mentions seeing a figure in black moving across the ridgeline at midnight, vanishing before any chase could be made. Though sensational in tone, these reports were taken seriously by the Harrison Gazette because of the consistency across multiple sources and because of the earlier history of strange occurrences in these parts of the Ozark Mountains. A traveling physician, Dr. Henry Bales, who had first encountered the sisters months prior, returned to the property at the request of the county. His notes, written in clinical, unembellished language, describe extreme emaciation, fractured sleep patterns, and heightened paranoia. He also observed that the sisters referred repeatedly to their father's ledgers, as if counting sins rather than sums. These observations hint at an inheritance that was not merely financial but psychological, binding the sisters to behaviors that neither the law nor conventional medicine could explain. By the end of 1902, Mill Creek Hollow had become a place people avoided after sunset, and the Morrison sisters had become figures simultaneously pitied and feared, living proof that the Ozarks' dense hills could conceal more than they revealed. As autumn deepened in 1902, the Morrison estate took on an even more foreboding aspect. Foliage turned to russet and gold, the creeks ran lower, and the wind through the Ozark ridges carried a hollow whistle that seemed to penetrate walls. The sisters' behavior became more regimented, almost ritualistic, according to the notes of a neighbor, Samuel Kirkwood, who observed them from the tree line. Kirkwood, a man known for his cautious demeanor, later recounted that he saw Catherine pacing the front porch for hours, ledger in hand, muttering dates and sums, while Elise repeatedly drew intricate marks in the dirt of the backyard. It was around this time that the first official investigation began. County Marshal Jonathan Clemens, tasked with tracing the disappearances of Silas Redding and James McAllister, documented his initial approach in a terse memo. The property is isolated, entry is resisted by verbal command and gesture. The household refuses cooperation. Clemens noted that even the dogs in the vicinity refused to approach, barking briefly before retreating into the forest. These small, uncanny details, he wrote, suggested an atmosphere unusual in normal human habitation. Local oral history preserved in later interviews hints that the sisters' reclusive nature had roots long before their father's death. In early 1890 census records, Elias Morrison is described as somewhat eccentric, but intelligent and meticulous, tending to both land and records with obsessive care. Neighbors remembered him as insisting that certain passages in the family ledger, particularly those concerning land minerals, were to be protected, or madness will follow. Though it may have been hyperbole at the time, the events of 1902 suggest that his warning carried a psychological weight that neither Catherine nor Elise could escape. The Ozark Mountains themselves added another layer of complication. Dense forest and uneven limestone terrain created areas where sound and light played tricks on perception. Marshal Clemens relied on guides from neighboring valleys, men accustomed to moving silently through hollows and bluffs. Even with their expertise, he reported disorientation within the estate's immediate surroundings, noting caverns under the house where echoes return like voices and the air smells faintly of iron. This subtle reference to geological oddities tied into the family's own holdings, mineral veins and small subterranean chambers were common in this part of the Ozarks, and Elias Morrison had apparently mapped them carefully, leaving notes in ledgers the sisters now guarded obsessively. By late October, sightings of the sisters had grown stranger. One witness, traveling from the nearby town of Jasper, claimed he saw Elise carrying a lantern down a slope, accompanied by shapes that were never identified. Catherine, meanwhile, seemed consumed by the ledgers, sometimes reading aloud in the empty rooms for hours. These accounts were later summarized in a brief county report. Behavior indicates extreme fixation, possibly delusional, likely exacerbated by environment and familial influence. The local press, though sparse in coverage, noted the peculiar atmosphere of Mill Creek Hollow. A small feature in the Harrison Gazette referred to the property as the Hollow of the Morrisons, describing how travelers felt an oppressive weight upon approaching the house, particularly during misty mornings when the valley seemed to breathe with its own rhythm. The piece also cited the Ozark Mountains' natural reclusiveness, highlighting that families in these valleys often went for months without formal contact with outsiders, which amplified the perception of isolation and strangeness. Meanwhile, within the house, reports from a visiting physician and a hired handyman, both kept in separate affidavits, indicate the sisters' obsession with patterns in the ledgers. Catherine would align coins and stones across tables, sometimes counting them into the early hours, while Elise drew maps and diagrams along the walls, some so intricate that they covered entire rooms. These were not casual doodles, they bore a precision that suggested calculation, ritual, or compulsion, a behavior later noted in psychological reviews of similar cases in isolated rural environments. Despite the ongoing investigation, no immediate resolution was reached. The disappearances remained unexplained, the sisters' actions enigmatic, and the estate itself continued to project an aura of quiet menace. As winter approached, the surrounding valley seemed to close in, leaving Mill Creek Hollow encased in fog, frost, and the whispered rumors of a community unwilling, or too fearful, to intervene. Winter settled over the Arkansas Ozarks in late 1902 with an unforgiving hand. Frost clung to the ridges, and the Mill Creek Hollow Valley became a muted expanse of snow and shadow. The Morrison sisters, isolated by choice and circumstance, had retreated further into the house, and accounts from nearby residents suggest that their days were consumed entirely by the inheritance left by Elias Morrison. Ledger entries, strange diagrams, and the precise arrangement of household items continued uninterrupted, as if the sisters were attempting to impose order on a world that otherwise felt hostile and chaotic. It was in early December that the first formal attempt to penetrate the estate's mysteries occurred. Marshal Jonathan Clemens, accompanied by a small contingent of deputies and guided by local woodsmen familiar with the Ozark Mountains, approached the property at dawn. Clemens' report, written in methodical detail, noted that the snow muffled footsteps but amplified other sounds: creaking boards, sudden thumps, and the faint rattling of metal from within the house. According to the memo, It is evident that the household is aware of our presence, though they make no direct contact. Inside the property, the sisters were reportedly calm but evasive. Catherine greeted the officers at the door, her expression measured, almost indifferent, while Elise lingered behind, pale and tense, eyes scanning the corners as if expecting something, or someone, to appear. Clemens' notes state that the sisters accepted no questions and provided no assistance, yet moved about the house with methodical precision, performing tasks that were repeated with alarming regularity. He added that the atmosphere felt monitored, not hospitable, and that the constables sensed an unnatural discipline that extended beyond normal eccentricity. While law enforcement struggled with access, local folklore began to fill in the gaps. One handwritten journal from a nearby farm, later recovered in the Harrison archives, described the sisters' nightly activities as a quiet parade of shadows, counting and arranging objects with purpose only they could discern. Tales told over hearths suggested that the land itself seemed to exert influence, a phenomenon occasionally noted by explorers of the Ozark Mountains, hollows, limestone caves, and dense canopy-created microclimates where sound distorted, and fogs persisted long after the wind had shifted. To many, it was as though the estate and the sisters were part of the landscape, inseparable and inexplicably altered by it. The inheritance itself, as reconstructed from Elias Morrison's ledgers, was more than monetary. The records reference quantities of black soil and crystalline substances, often alongside measurements of candlelight and shadow in specific rooms. Historians later speculated that these notations indicated an attempt to control environmental factors within the house. Light, air, sound, suggesting a belief in patterns and correspondences that bordered on obsessive. Some accounts even suggest the sisters continued these practices after their father's death, interpreting the notes as instructions left specifically for them. In January 1903, another disappearance intensified local concern. A handyman named Thomas Grady, hired to repair the back barn roof, failed to return after his first day. His cart and tools were left meticulously arranged near the barn entrance, mirroring the earlier incidents with Silas Redding and James McAllister. County records note that search parties combed the surrounding forest and hollows for days, but found nothing. Observers reported an unusual stillness in the forest, a silence that seemed to follow them as they scoured the valley. One witness recorded, "It was as if the hills themselves were swallowing sound." At the same time, Dr. Henry Bales, who had seen the sisters months prior, returned to assess their mental state. His observations, preserved in clinical language, documented severe malnourishment, fixation on inherited ledgers, and extreme sensitivity to environmental stimuli. Elise, he noted, would react violently to any unexpected sound, while Catherine appeared increasingly detached, as if she were performing tasks in another world entirely. His conclusion was sober and brief. The sisters were living under conditions that exacerbated pre-existing fragility, influenced both by isolation and the peculiar demands of the inheritance. By mid-winter, Mill Creek Hollow had become a place shunned by locals. Paths leading to the Morrison property were avoided, livestock grazed farther away, and travelers spoke in hushed tones of the hollow of the sisters who count shadows. Even Marshal Clemens hesitated to return without backup, acknowledging in his official correspondence that the combination of isolation, environmental distortion, and psychological fixation made the property uniquely difficult to manage. In these months, the foundation was laid for what would become one of the most chilling and enigmatic cases in Arkansas Ozarks history. The land, the ledgers, and the sisters themselves were entwined in a pattern that outsiders could neither understand nor disrupt. Rumors spread, testimonies were recorded, and the estate solidified its reputation as a locus of quiet, persistent menace, a place where the inheritance, both tangible and intangible, appeared to dictate behavior and bend minds to its peculiar logic. By early 1903, the Morrison estate had become a site of intense scrutiny, though formal intervention remained limited. County authorities were cautious. The combination of difficult terrain, a small but vigilant local population, and the sisters' evasive comportment made direct action risky. Despite repeated reports of disappearances and strange behavior, the case files show that deputies were often hesitant to enter the property without careful planning. The house itself resists, Marshall Clemens wrote in his February 1903 report, and the terrain ensures that any misstep leaves one lost or exposed to the elements. Accounts from locals continued to trickle in, further shaping the narrative of the hollow. Martha Lee, a widow living several ridges away, recalled seeing Elise at dusk, tracing circles in the frost on the yard, whispering numbers I could not catch, but which seemed to echo beyond the trees. Meanwhile, Catherine's meticulous arrangement of objects, coins, small stones, and pieces of blackened soil from their father's holdings, was observed by neighbors through slats in the window shutters. The precision suggested a purpose that eluded even those accustomed to eccentric rural habits. The property itself contributed to the sense of disquiet. The Ozark Mountains were well documented for their dense canopy, rugged limestone formations, and intricate system of hollows and caves. Investigators later noted that the Morrison estate included a natural depression behind the house, partially hidden by underbrush, which created a faint, persistent hum in the wind. The effect, described in local surveys and early geologic studies, produced auditory illusions that could be misinterpreted as voices or footsteps. It was, in essence, a natural amplifier of unease, one that the sisters seemed to exploit, intentionally or not, in their daily routines. In March 1903, the estate drew wider attention when another worker vanished. Samuel Dyer, a cartographer hired to survey portions of the land, failed to return after exploring a hollow behind the barn. His disappearance mirrored earlier cases in that his tools and personal effects were found neatly arranged, with no sign of struggle. A later affidavit from a search party member mentions, or an oppressive silence and sudden drafts of cold air that seemed unnatural, a sentiment echoed in multiple recollections of the area. One historian examining the events decades later noted the parallels between the sisters' fixation on the ledgers and the broader cultural fascination with patterns and isolated communities of the Ozark Mountains. Elias Morrison's notes, which included references to minerals, shadows, and celestial alignments, suggested a form of inherited obsession. The sisters, bound both by upbringing and the cryptic guidance of these ledgers, appeared to interpret their inheritance as more than property. It was a mandate, a code, and a chain simultaneously. Despite growing concern, formal law enforcement action was still limited. Local constables, wary of the terrain and the sisters' unpredictable behavior, focused primarily on observation and documentation. Dr. Henry Bales, returning once more, noted that Catherine displayed heightened rigidity, cataloging objects and reciting sequences of numbers, while Elise wandered in a trance-like state, tracing faint etchings on walls and floors. Bales' clinical notes, preserved in the Harrison County Archives, describe a household caught in repetition, driven by inherited instruction and the isolation imposed by the landscape. Rumors among townsfolk became more detailed, suggesting not only obsession but a potential link to the fate of missing laborers. Some claimed to have glimpsed shadows moving through the windows at night. Others said they heard whispering counting in languages no one recognized. While no evidence supported supernatural claims, the consistency of reports led investigators and historians to consider the psychological impact of extended isolation in combination with the peculiar inheritance and the eerie acoustics of the Ozark Mountains. The winter of 1903 closed with Mill Creek Hollow encased in ice and fog. Paths were deserted, livestock were driven farther afield, and the Morrison sisters remained ensconced in the house, their daily rituals continuing uninterrupted. The inheritance, both tangible and intangible, seemed to exert a persistent influence over their lives, shaping behavior in ways that law, medicine, and neighbors could neither prevent nor understand. Even at this stage, the story of the Morrison sisters remained contained within county records, newspaper clippings, and the occasional journal. Though outwardly ordinary, these documents hinted at a profound, quiet madness cultivated by isolation, familial legacy, and the peculiar topography of the Ozark Mountains. A combination that would leave a lingering echo in local memory for decades to come. Spring of 1903 brought a fragile sense of renewal to the Ozark ridges, yet Mill Creek Hollow remained a place of unease. Snow melted into muddy trails, and the first shoots of green emerged among the hollows. But the Morrison estate appeared impervious to seasonal change. Observers noted that the sisters maintained strict routines, as though time itself had little effect on their daily practices. Catherine continued her ledger work, while Elise wandered the rooms in near silence, tracing patterns and muttering sequences of numbers, sometimes for hours without pause. It was during this period that the first deliberate investigation into the cellar began. Neighbors had long spoken of unusual odors and sounds emanating from the lower level, but no one had dared enter. A young laborer, Thomas Green, sent by Marshal Clemens, cautiously descended the stairs under supervision. Green described the space as narrow, lined with earthen walls, and faintly damp, with what appeared to be small ceramic jars and metal implements scattered along the floor. There was no sign of struggle, but the arrangement of objects suggested methodical activity, not random placement. He later wrote that it felt like a study of meticulous patterns, something the mind struggles to comprehend. Meanwhile, the local press continued to document the hollow, though coverage remained restrained, likely due to the fear and uncertainty surrounding the property. A short report in the Harrison Gazette described the property as a household of mystery, its inhabitants committed wholly to habits unknown to any observer outside its walls. Notably, the article referenced the Ozark Mountains' geography, noting how dense forests and hidden hollows made the estate virtually inaccessible, and how the sisters' behaviors could be amplified by the peculiar acoustic and visual properties of the terrain. By late spring, new disappearances added tension. A traveling woodsman named Elijah Ford arrived to perform minor repairs but never returned. His axe and provisions were left neatly stacked near the edge of the forest, a pattern familiar from earlier incidents. In addition, several witnesses reported seeing the sisters walking along ridge lines at dawn, Elise carrying a lantern and Catherine clutching her ledger, seemingly communicating with each other through gestures or unrecorded signs. Their movements were silent, deliberate, and uncanny in their precision. Dr. Henry Bales returned once more, documenting that the sisters displayed extreme sensitivity to environmental factors. Catherine reacted sharply to changes in daylight or temperature, while Elise seemed attuned to subtler shifts in air or sound. Bales' notes imply that the sisters' perception of the inheritance extended beyond mere objects and financial records. It encompassed space, sound, and the passage of time itself. These behaviors, he concluded, were consistent with severe psychological fixation, exacerbated by isolation and a demanding, cryptically structured legacy. The county's formal records from this period reflect frustration and unease. Marshal Clemens repeatedly petitioned for additional resources to monitor the property, noting that traditional methods of oversight were ineffective. Search parties often returned disoriented or with minimal findings, hampered by fog, uneven terrain, and the peculiar acoustics of the hollows. Clemens' reports frequently mention, the house itself appears to resist intrusion, and those who enter often feel compelled to leave quickly or behave with unnatural caution. Local oral history captures a further layer of the story. Elders recount that the sisters engaged in nightly routines involving placement of small stones, black soil, and traces of the crystalline substances noted in their father's ledgers. Some townsfolk claimed that Catherine occasionally recited sequences from the ledgers aloud, while Elise, in a trance-like state, traced markings on walls and floors. These reports, though anecdotal, were remarkably consistent across multiple testimonies, suggesting that the behaviors were deliberate and recurring. Even in spring, Mill Creek Hollow remained largely avoided. Paths were seldom traveled, livestock were kept at a distance, and travelers spoke in hushed tones of the counting sisters. The estate became a locus not just of disappearance but of quiet dread, its influence extending subtly through the surrounding hills. The Ozark Mountains themselves seemed to reinforce this isolation, the valleys and hollows acting as a natural barrier, amplifying sound, shadow, and rumor in ways that lent credence to the unsettling accounts circulating among local residents. By mid-1903, observers and authorities alike began to understand that the inheritance left by Elias Morrison was not merely a matter of property. It was a framework for behavior, obsession, and control that shaped every aspect of the sisters' lives. What had begun as curiosity and concern now approached something deeper, a pattern of quiet madness rooted in isolation, legacy, and the unforgiving geography of the Ozark Mountains. By the summer of 1903, Mill Creek Hollow had become nearly synonymous with unease throughout the northern Ozarks. Travelers who inadvertently approached the Morrison property reported an oppressive stillness in the trees, and some described feeling watched, as if the land itself bore witness to the sisters' routines. One local farmer, Elias Thompson, recorded in his diary that he sensed a rhythm in the hills, footsteps or shadows that did not belong to any man. While folkloric in tone, such entries were later cross-referenced with county reports demonstrating the consistency of local unease surrounding the hollow. The sisters' obsession with their inheritance had deepened. Catherine's ledger work intensified, consuming entire rooms as she cataloged objects, ledgers and scraps of paper. Elise's tracing of patterns on walls and floors became more elaborate, sometimes incorporating materials from the natural surroundings, stones, soil, and remnants of timber from the property. One neighbor later recalled that the sisters treated these elements as tokens of the father's will. Though no one could discern the rules governing their arrangement, Marshal Clemens, still coordinating monitoring of the estate, documented that the sisters' behaviors appeared to follow a complex, self-imposed structure. Nightly routines included repeated pacing of hallways, careful realignment of objects, and seemingly random rituals with no clear explanation. It is as if the house itself imposes the schedule. Clemens wrote in a report, noting that intrusions were met with silence rather than aggression, yet left visitors unnerved and disoriented. The disappearance of another laborer, William Harkins, underscored the growing danger, or at least the perception of danger, associated with the estate. Harkins was last seen hauling firewood to the back cellar, a task similar to those undertaken by Silas Redding and James McAllister in previous months. His tools were found arranged neatly near the door, his journal left open on a table. Local testimony describes hearing footsteps descending the cellar, and then an abrupt, unsettling silence. Search parties scoured the hollows, finding no trace of him, and the incident further cemented the sisters' reputation in regional folklore. At this stage, observers began to analyze the environment in relation to the sisters' behaviors. Studies of the Ozark Mountains conducted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries emphasized the unique acoustic properties of hollows and limestone caves. Echoes can mimic voices, and fog frequently produces optical distortions. Some county reports cautiously suggest that the combination of isolation, inherited obsession, and the distorted environmental cues of the hollow may have amplified behaviors perceived as unusual or alarming. Within the household, Dr. Henry Bales continued his meticulous observations. He recorded that Catherine often corrected Elise when the latter strayed from exact patterns in the ledgers or the arrangement of objects. Elise, in turn, appeared increasingly fragile, retreating to corners or to the cellar when she was not actively engaged in tracing marks. Bales noted that neither sister appeared violent, yet their obsession and isolation created a scenario that outsiders interpreted as menacing or unnatural. Local oral history added further detail, claiming that the sisters communicated with one another through subtle gestures and glances, a language developed over years of seclusion. Observers described Elise pointing to specific floor markings while Catherine consulted her ledger, a form of silent coordination that reinforced the impression of ritualized behavior. These accounts, though anecdotal, were consistent across multiple sources and were later cited by researchers studying the interaction between isolation, inherited property, and psychological compulsion in rural Ozark communities. By late summer, The hollow itself became a character in the narrative, shaping perception as much as the sisters did. Dense forests, steep ridges, and hidden hollows created areas where sound and light were distorted, lending credibility to witnesses who reported whispers, shadows, or figures moving unnaturally. Even county authorities acknowledged that the geography amplified the sisters' influence, creating an environment in which unusual behavior was difficult to monitor or interpret. The inheritance, its ledgers, chests, and cryptic instructions, had become both a source of structure and a mechanism of confinement. By mid-1903, Catherine and Elise Morrison were entirely defined by it, their days dictated by the estate's contents and the patterns within. Outsiders could neither fully comprehend nor disrupt the routines, leaving Mill Creek Hollow an isolated locus of quiet obsession, whispered rumors, and unresolvable mystery. As autumn approached in 1903, Mill Creek Hollow had assumed the reputation of a place to be avoided. The Ozark Mountains themselves seemed to conspire with the sisters' isolation, as fog draped the hollows for days on end and the dense canopy filtered sunlight into muted, shifting patterns. Locals reported that approaching the Morrison estate evoked a sense of disorientation and unease. One resident, Abigail Hart, wrote in a brief affidavit that the property felt alive, as though it breathed with the actions of those inside, a phrase that would recur in later folkloric accounts of the hollow. The sisters' daily routines grew ever more intricate. Catherine spent long hours at her ledger, cataloging coins, soil samples, and the faintly glimmering crystalline substances noted in her father's estate records. Elise moved quietly between rooms, tracing intricate designs across floors and walls, occasionally kneeling to arrange stones or shards of timber, according to patterns only she understood. Observers described these patterns as deliberate and repetitive, with the sisters sometimes aligning objects according to light, shadow, or sound cues from the surrounding property. Marshall Clemens reports continued to emphasize the difficulty of engaging with the estate, despite repeated attempts to investigate disappearances and strange activity. Law enforcement personnel found the combination of topography and isolation challenging. The Ozark Mountains, hollowed valleys, limestone ridges, and dense undergrowth made the area nearly impervious to casual exploration. Clemens noted that even with guides, deputies often returned disoriented, reporting an eerie stillness punctuated by sounds that did not belong to any living thing. By late 1903, additional disappearances contributed to the hollow's notoriety. One young woodsman, Elijah Ford, vanished after performing routine maintenance on the barn. His tools were found neatly stacked near the entrance, his notes left untouched. Witnesses claimed to see shapes moving along ridgelines at twilight, though none could confirm their identity. These patterns closely mirrored previous incidents, suggesting either a repeated behavioral pattern within the estate or the influence of unseen environmental forces. Dr. Henry Bales, who had monitored the sisters intermittently over the past year, documented further deterioration in Elise's mental state. She was increasingly prone to prolonged periods of silence, only breaking to trace or whisper sequences noted in the ledgers. Catherine, meanwhile, exhibited near obsessive attention to detail, enforcing rules derived from her father's documents. Bales observed that their behaviors suggested a combination of inherited compulsion and environmental influence, compounded by extreme isolation. Local folklore increasingly blended with factual reporting. Residents recounted seeing Elise at night, carrying a lantern across frozen streams, or standing at the edge of hollows tracing circular shapes in the frost. Catherine was described as consulting her ledger in the same areas, performing movements that seemed coordinated yet indecipherable. These consistent accounts contributed to the development of a narrative in which the hollow itself seemed to amplify obsession, turning patterns of behavior into public unease. At the same time, county records indicate that the sisters were meticulous in documenting their own routines. Notes in the ledger describe times, sequences of objects, and the movement of air or light within rooms. Observers suggest that Catherine and Elise treated these instructions as both guidance and obligation, as though failing to follow them precisely would carry severe consequences. The pattern of obsessive documentation echoed themes noted in studies of the Ozark Mountains, where families often imposed strict, inherited rules in isolated environments, magnifying behavioral eccentricities over generations. By the end of 1903, Mill Creek Hollow had become more than a property. It was a locus of obsession, fear, and speculation. The combination of geography, inheritance, and isolation ensured that the Morrison sisters' routines remained largely hidden, yet palpable to anyone approaching the estate. Whispered accounts circulated throughout the region, often mentioning shadows moving unnaturally, strange sounds, and the eerie cadence of steps in the fog-laden hollows. The inheritance, both material and psychological, had taken full hold. Catherine and Elise Morrison were no longer merely reclusive. They were ensnared in a system of ritual, pattern, and legacy that dictated every waking moment. Outsiders could document or speculate, but they could not intervene. The hollow, and the sisters within it, remained a closed system of obsession, a quiet, relentless testament to the power of isolation, environment, and inheritance in shaping human behavior. By the winter of 1903, Mill Creek Hollow had settled into a grim rhythm, one that mirrored the unyielding contours of the Ozark Mountains themselves. Snow blanketed the ridges and valleys, rendering the property both visible and yet impenetrable. The Morrison sisters, isolated and absorbed by their inheritance, had perfected their routines to a degree that seemed almost ceremonial. Catherine meticulously arranged coins, soil samples, and crystalline remnants from her father's estate, referencing precise locations documented in the ledgers. Elise, in turn, wandered the halls tracing patterns along walls and floors, occasionally aligning objects with beams of sunlight or lantern light. These movements were deliberate, repeated, and exhaustive. It was during this period that Marshal Jonathan Clemens intensified his surveillance of the property. Recognizing that standard patrols were inadequate, he employed local woodsmen skilled in navigating the hollows and limestone ridges of the Ozarks. Clemens' reports describe the hollow as a maze of shadows and echoes, in which human presence is quickly disoriented. He also noted a pattern of behavior within the sisters' routines, the objects they manipulated. The alignment of furniture and the sequences of gestures appeared to follow an internal logic tied to the ledgers. Yet the logic itself remained indecipherable. Disappearance reports persisted. One young man, Nathaniel Crawford, hired to clear underbrush along the creek, vanished without a trace. His cart, tools, and personal effects were left neatly arranged near the edge of the property, mimicking earlier incidents with Silas Redding, James McAllister, and Thomas Green. Search parties scoured the surrounding hills and hollows for days, often returning disoriented by fog, uneven terrain, and the acoustic distortions produced by the ridges. Witnesses described hearing footsteps or whispers that seemed to come from inside the property. Though no one could confirm their origin, Dr. Henry Bales returned to the hollow in early 1904, recording extensive observations in his journal. He noted that Catherine's attention to her ledger and the objects it catalogued had reached an obsessive intensity. She appeared almost hypnotically bound to its dictates. Elise exhibited heightened sensitivity to her surroundings, reacting strongly to shifts in light, sound, or air currents. Bales concluded that the sisters' behaviors were not merely eccentric, but indicative of a psychological state amplified by environmental isolation, inherited expectations, and the ritualized obligations embedded within the estate. The county archives contain multiple affidavits and testimonies from neighbors, each echoing similar details: flickering lights at night, sounds of footsteps or murmured words from within the hollow, and fleeting glimpses of the sisters performing repetitive movements in the yard or along ridgelines. Some accounts describe Elise carrying a lantern while tracing patterns in the soil, or Catherine consulting the ledger at intervals with precise gestures and vocal repetitions. The convergence of these observations lent the case an unsettling credibility, reinforcing the perception that Mill Creek Hollow was governed by rules entirely opaque to outsiders. Local folklore further entwined with documented events. Stories told over hearths described the hollow as a place where shadows moved independently, where echoes seemed to answer questions unspoken, and where the sisters appeared attuned to forces unseen. While no evidence of supernatural activity exists, these accounts reflected a consistent pattern of human perception affected by isolation, the peculiar acoustics of the Ozark Mountains, and the obsessive routines dictated by the inheritance. By the close of 1904, Mill Creek Hollow had achieved the status of both legend and unresolved case. The sisters' behaviors were meticulously observed, but never fully understood, and the combination of isolation, inherited materials, and environmental factors created a closed system in which outsiders could neither intervene nor comprehend fully. County reports, newspaper clippings, and Dr. Bale's journal collectively depict a household consumed by pattern, repetition, and the meticulous enforcement of a legacy that had become an inescapable structure of daily life. Even as the world beyond the ridges continued its ordinary rhythms, the hollow remained suspended in time, dominated by the inheritance of Elias Morrison. Every object, movement, and utterance within the estate adhered to an internal logic, as if the sisters were both custodians and prisoners of a mandate older than themselves. Observers could only document, speculate, and wonder. How much of the madness came from the estate, how much from the sisters, and how much from the deep, whispering hollows of the Ozark Mountains themselves? The spring of 1904 brought little relief to Mill Creek Hollow. Melting snow revealed the deep hollows and limestone crevices that characterized the Ozark Mountains, emphasizing the isolation of the Morrison estate. The sisters' routines had become almost ceremonial, with Catherine fully immersed in the ledgers and Elise engaged in tracing complex patterns across floors and walls. These behaviors, though internally consistent, struck outsiders as obsessive and ritualistic, a structured madness that seemed inseparable from the estate itself. County Marshal Jonathan Clemens continued his careful observation of the property, noting in his spring report that the sisters exhibit precision beyond ordinary comprehension, manipulating objects and recording sequences as though bound by the dictates of an unseen authority. Clemens highlighted that the topography itself amplified the perception of unease. The surrounding ridges, hollows, and dense canopy distorted sound and shadow, giving ordinary movement an uncanny quality. This environment, he suggested, may have heightened the sisters' fixation on inherited instructions, compounding both the psychological and perceptual challenges of the estate. Additional disappearances compounded local concern. A traveling carpenter named Amos Whitfield vanished while repairing a section of the barn roof. His tools were found neatly aligned near the entrance, his journal left open with faint sketches resembling patterns noted in earlier affidavits. Search parties combed the hollows and ridges, but natural obstacles, heavy vegetation, and fog consistently thwarted efforts. Witnesses reported hearing faint whispers or glimpsing lantern light moving in the distance, though no one could verify the source. These recurring patterns mirrored previous incidents, reinforcing the unsettling sense that the hollow itself dictated what outsiders might see or experience. Dr. Henry Bales returned in late spring to document the sisters' condition. He noted that Catherine had become almost entirely absorbed by her ledger, correcting Elise whenever the latter deviated from precise arrangements of objects or patterns on floors and walls. Elise, increasingly fragile and reactive, spent hours in trance, like observation of shadows, soil, and light, often repeating movements with meticulous regularity. Bale's observations concluded that the sisters' behaviors were consistent with extreme psychological fixation, likely exacerbated by isolation, environmental pressures, and the inherited obligations that governed their household. The local press continued to cover Mill Creek Hollow cautiously. Short entries in the Harrison Gazette described a household defined by ritual and mystery. The estate of the Morrison sisters resists inquiry, its inhabitants governed by patterns invisible to the casual observer. Folklore mingled with fact in these accounts. Locals claimed to hear counting or murmured numbers in the evenings, see shadows moving independently, and glimpse the sisters walking the ridge with lanterns, performing actions that appeared coordinated yet indecipherable. While unverified, these reports were remarkably consistent, suggesting the patterns were deliberate and persistent. County records and testimonies from neighbors reveal a deepening awareness of the sisters' inherited compulsion. Catherine and Elise were not simply eccentric. They were bound to a system of behavior encoded in their father's ledgers, reinforced by environmental isolation and the peculiar acoustics and topography of the Ozark Mountains. Observers noted that even minor deviations from prescribed actions elicited anxiety or corrective behaviors, reinforcing the impression of a household entirely governed by legacy and ritual. By summer 1904, Mill Creek Hollow had become a locus of quiet dread. Paths to the property were avoided, livestock were kept distant, and travelers spoke in hushed tones about the hollow of the Counting Sisters. Yet, despite observation, documentation, and occasional intervention, the estate remained a closed system. The sisters' behaviors continued uninterrupted, and the landscape of the Ozarks amplified the perception of their rituals, making outsiders' understanding fleeting and incomplete. Even as seasonal change brought renewed growth to the ridges and valleys, the hollow remained dominated by inheritance, obsession, and isolation. Catherine and Elise Morrison, enmeshed in patterns dictated by their father's ledgers, performed their daily routines with unwavering precision, largely impervious to outside interference. Mill Creek Hollow, shrouded in fog, shadow, and the echoes of repeated ritual, remained a place where legacy and environment converged to produce a quiet, persistent, and inexplicable madness, an echo of Elias Morrison's inheritance that would linger in the Ozark Mountains long after anyone had departed. By the autumn of 1904, the Morrison sisters had fully internalized the rhythms of Mill Creek Hollow. The estate's isolation, reinforced by the dense forests and hollows of the Ozark Mountains, allowed their routines to unfold without interruption. Catherine's ledger work had reached near obsessive levels, cataloging objects, soil samples, and crystalline remnants with meticulous detail. Elise continued her silent tracing of patterns along floors, walls, and occasionally the frozen ground outside, performing movements that observers later described as a choreography of inherited instruction. Marshal Jonathan Clemens documented the sisters' behaviors with growing concern. In one report, he noted that Catherine and Elise communicated in subtle gestures, coordinating their activities without words. Even the most vigilant observers cannot discern the rules governing these interactions. He wrote, emphasizing that the pattern seemed internally logical but impervious to outside interpretation. The landscape, Clemens added, amplified these behaviors. The hollows and limestone ridges distorted sound and shadow, creating illusions that made even familiar observers second-guess their perception. Additional disappearances heightened the aura of unease. A young farmhand, Lewis Cartwright, vanished while delivering provisions to the estate. His belongings were found arranged with precision near the barn entrance, following a pattern that matched previous incidents. Search parties scoured the surrounding valleys and hollows but found nothing. Witnesses reported hearing faint footsteps, whispers, or the flicker of lantern light moving across the ridges, though none could confirm the source. These repeated events reinforced the perception that the hollow itself dictated the rules of engagement for outsiders. Dr. Henry Bales returned to the estate to continue his observations. He noted a marked intensification in both sisters' behaviors. Catherine corrected Elise's arrangements with precision, while Elise seemed increasingly consumed by visual patterns of light, shadow, and objects within the estate. Bales concluded that the sisters' actions were consistent with severe psychological fixation, reinforced by isolation, environmental pressures, and inherited mandates encoded in Elias Morrison's ledgers. These were not simple eccentricities. They were behaviors shaped and sustained by an interplay of psychological, environmental, and familial factors. Local oral histories from the period describe the sisters' nocturnal routines in vivid detail. One witness recounted seeing Elise carry a lantern along the frozen creek while Catherine consulted her ledger in the yard, aligning objects in accordance with unseen rules. Neighbors reported hearing murmured counting and observing shadows moving in ways that seemed coordinated yet indecipherable. While anecdotal, These reports were strikingly consistent, suggesting a deliberate and persistent pattern of behavior rather than random eccentricity. Newspaper coverage remained cautious, emphasizing the extraordinary yet verifiable aspects of the estate. A brief entry in the Harrison Gazette described Mill Creek Hollow as a property governed by its inhabitants' rituals, which resist observation and defy conventional explanation. The article referenced the Ozark Mountains topography, noting how dense forests, steep ridges, and hidden hollows create conditions where sound and light behave unusually, intensifying the perception of abnormality within isolated households. By late 1904, observers began to understand that the inheritance had become a binding force. The ledgers and chests left by Elias Morrison were no longer merely property, they were instruments of compulsion, structuring every aspect of daily life. The sisters' behaviors, ritualized, precise, and isolated, demonstrated an interaction between environment, legacy, and psychology rarely documented in county records. Even experienced marshals, doctors, and neighbors could only observe, record, and speculate. Mill Creek Hollow, cloaked in fog shadow, and the echoes of repetitive routines, remained both physically and psychologically isolated. The sisters' internal logic governed the estate with unwavering rigor. Outsiders could enter, document, or attempt intervention, but the combination of inherited obligation, environmental distortion, and obsessive practice ensured that the hollow remained largely impervious. In this way, the estate and the inheritance held sway over Catherine and Elise, shaping their existence and cementing Mill Creek Hollow's reputation as a locus of quiet, persistent, and unexplained madness. Winter of 1904 settled once more over Mill Creek Hollow, blanketing the Ozark ridges and hollows in snow and fog. The Morrison sisters' routines, already rigid and ritualistic, intensified under the isolation imposed by the season. Catherine spent long hours consulting her father's ledgers, arranging objects and cataloging soil, minerals, and small trinkets, while Elise traced patterns along walls, floors, and the snow-covered yard. Observers later described her movements as deliberate, trance-like, and synchronized in some unspoken way with Catherine's ledger work. Marshal Jonathan Clemens continued to monitor the property cautiously. In his official notes, he emphasized the difficulty of interacting with the sisters, noting that their routines were so precise and insular that outsiders could neither interrupt nor fully comprehend them. Even when approached directly, they respond only within the framework of their internal system. Clemens wrote, "The surrounding Ozark Mountains, dense forests, ridges, and limestone hollows amplified the impression of estrangement, distorting sound and shadow and contributing to a pervasive sense of unreality for anyone attempting to observe the estate. New disappearances continued to fuel both local fear and formal concern. One hired laborer, a young man named Silas Moreland, vanished after assisting with minor repairs in the barn. His tools were found meticulously arranged. His journal left open with sketches and measurements resembling those found in earlier incidents. Search parties combed the hollows and valleys, but topographical obstacles, fog, and the auditory illusions produced by limestone formations frustrated every attempt at recovery. Witnesses reported seeing lantern light moving along ridges and faint shadowy figures, consistent with prior accounts of the sisters' nocturnal activity. Dr. Henry Bales returned to assess the sisters' condition during this period. He observed that Catherine's preoccupation with her ledger had reached a compulsive intensity, while Elise's attention to light, shadow, and spatial patterns had become more pronounced. Bales described their interactions as a coordinated ritual. Catherine enforced precision in the arrangement of objects, while Elise executed the physical tasks with exacting care. He concluded that their behaviors were neither casual nor recreational, but rather indicative of extreme psychological fixation compounded by environmental isolation and the mandates embedded in Elias Morrison's inheritance. Local oral histories and affidavits from neighbors describe nocturnal behaviors with remarkable consistency. Witnesses reported seeing Elise carry a lantern through the snow while Catherine consulted her ledger, adjusting and arranging objects in patterns that were invisible to the casual observer. The sisters' movements seemed coordinated yet indecipherable, reinforcing the perception that Mill Creek Hollow operated under its own internal logic, one that merged inheritance, geography, and psychological compulsion into a single, inescapable system. Newspaper coverage remained cautious, emphasizing verifiable details while avoiding speculation. A brief entry in the Harrison Gazette described the estate as a household governed entirely by patterns known only to its occupants. The article acknowledged the Ozark Mountains' influence, noting that dense forests, hidden hollows, and irregular topography could distort perception and sound, magnifying the impression of strange or ritualistic activity. Observers, both local and official, found themselves constrained by the estate's isolation, unable to intervene or fully understand the sisters' actions. By early 1905, Mill Creek Hollow had become a locus of quiet dread. The combination of inheritance, environmental isolation, and ritualized behavior ensured that the sisters' routines remained uninterrupted. Outsiders could document events, speculate on their significance, or attempt entry, but the property, the ledgers, and the sisters' obsessive practices formed an interlocking system resistant to disruption. The hollow, shrouded in fog, shadows, and echoes, had become more than a physical location. It was a psychological landscape, one in which the inheritance exerted persistent control, shaping both space and human behavior in ways outsiders could never fully interpret. Even as the surrounding valleys of the Ozark Mountains continued their seasonal cycles, Mill Creek Hollow remained suspended in time. Catherine and Elise Morrison, bound by legacy and compulsive practice, continued to perform daily rituals with unwavering precision. The estate, the inheritance, and the environmental isolation worked together to create a world contained entirely within itself. A locus of methodical obsession, quiet menace, and unresolved mystery that would haunt local memory long after the immediate events faded from official records. Spring of 1905 brought a tentative thaw to the Ozark ridges surrounding Mill Creek Hollow. Yet the Morrison sisters remained fully entrenched in their rituals. Catherine's ledger work, once largely a matter of cataloging inherited items, had grown to encompass every object within the household. Coins, soil samples, crystal fragments, and even scraps of wood were cataloged, aligned, and realigned with precise adherence to sequences that outsiders could not decipher. Elise, meanwhile, continued her pattern tracing, moving from walls to floors to the frozen ground outside, her gestures meticulous and unwavering. Their behaviors, though repetitive, bore a logic entirely internal, a code dictated by the inheritance and reinforced through isolation. Marshal Jonathan Clemens continued careful surveillance of the estate, noting both the sisters' extreme precision and the amplifying effect of the landscape. The hollows, limestone ridges, and dense forests distorted sound and shadow, giving every movement an eerie resonance. Clemens reported that even minor deviations from the sisters' routines appeared to provoke immediate corrective action within the household. These observations suggested that the inheritance, Elias Morrison's ledgers, chests, and cryptic notes, had become both framework and constraint, shaping behavior in ways impossible for outsiders to influence. Disappearance reports persisted, reinforcing Mill Creek Hollow's reputation as a place of quiet menace. One young laborer, Peter Langston, vanished after assisting with repairs to the barn roof. His tools were arranged neatly near the entrance, and his journal lay open with sketches reminiscent of Elise's wall patterns. Search parties combed nearby hollows and ridges, but snowmelt, dense vegetation, and the acoustic anomalies of the terrain hindered recovery. Witnesses reported faint lantern light moving along ridges at dusk, echoing prior sightings of the sisters' coordinated nocturnal activities. Dr. Henry Bales returned to document the sisters' condition, observing the intensification of obsessive behaviors. Catherine enforced meticulous adherence to ledger instructions, while Elise's pattern tracing became increasingly elaborate, incorporating elements of light, shadow, and material placement that seemed to align with subtle environmental cues. Bales concluded that the sisters' behaviors were the result of severe psychological fixation, exacerbated by environmental isolation and the compulsive framework established by their father's inheritance. He noted that these were not casual eccentricities, but highly structured behaviors that imposed a form of internal order on the household. Local oral histories preserved accounts of nocturnal activity. Witnesses consistently described Elise carrying a lantern across yards or hollows while Catherine consulted the ledger, realigning objects with precise gestures. Observers noted that these movements appeared coordinated but indecipherable, suggesting an internal logic inaccessible to outsiders. These accounts, repeated across multiple affidavits, reinforced the impression that Mill Creek Hollow was governed by a system entirely of the sisters' making, amplified by the topography of the Ozark Mountains. Newspaper coverage continued to tread carefully. A brief entry in the Harrison Gazette described the estate as a household operating under rules known only to its occupants, resistant to observation or interference. The article referenced the Ozark Mountains' rugged terrain and dense forest, noting that acoustic and visual distortions could heighten the perception of unusual behavior. Observers, it noted, were often disoriented, their perception shaped by the landscape as much as by the sisters' actions. By mid-1905, Mill Creek Hollow had solidified its status as a locus of quiet dread. The inheritance, environmental isolation, and obsessive routines created a closed system, resistant to intervention and largely impervious to outside understanding. Catherine and Elise Morrison, bound by the legacy of Elias Morrison's ledgers, continued their meticulous rituals with unwavering precision. Paths remained deserted, livestock were kept distant, and travelers spoke in hushed tones of the hollow where counting, alignment, and repetition governed every movement. Even as the surrounding Ozarks came alive with the cycles of spring, Mill Creek Hollow remained a place apart. The sisters' routines, reinforced by inheritance and isolation, ensured that the estate operated according to its own internal logic, a world in which the legacy of Elias Morrison dictated the rhythm of every day, every movement and every shadow, leaving outsiders to observe, speculate, and remain unsettled by the unresolved patterns of the hollow. By late 1905, the Morrison sisters had become entirely defined by the rhythms of Mill Creek Hollow. The Ozark ridges and hollows, cloaked in seasonal mists, created an environment in which isolation, sound distortion, and shadow combined to reinforce their rituals. Catherine's ledger work had grown increasingly intricate, detailing the position of coins, soil samples, crystal fragments, and household items with almost mathematical precision. Elise's tracing of patterns along floors, walls, and the surrounding grounds remained uninterrupted, her movements deliberate, repetitive, and coordinated with Catherine's actions in ways outsiders could not discern. Marshal Jonathan Clemens reports from this period highlight both the sisters' extreme precision and the amplifying effect of the hollow's terrain. He observed that deviations from established routines prompted immediate corrective actions within the household. Even minor shifts in the placement of objects were met with a disciplined adjustment, underscoring the degree to which the inheritance, Elias Morrison's ledgers and instructions, functioned as both guide and constraint. Clemens remarked that the estate resists intrusion not through force, but through the inexorable adherence of its occupants to an internal logic. The pattern of disappearances continued, reinforcing the hollow's growing reputation. One young worker, Daniel Fry, disappeared after assisting with minor repairs to the barn floor. His tools were arranged neatly, and his journal, left open, contained sketches reminiscent of Elise's patterns. Local search parties scoured the hollows and ridges, but environmental obstacles, fog, and the natural acoustic distortions of the limestone valleys rendered recovery impossible. Witnesses continued to report faint lantern light moving along the ridges at dusk, aligning with previous accounts of the sisters' nocturnal activity. Dr. Henry Bales returned once more, noting the intensification of obsessive behaviors. Catherine enforced meticulous adherence to the ledger, correcting any deviation by Elias. Elise's movements were increasingly trance-like, incorporating subtle cues from light, shadow, and environmental texture. Bales concluded that these behaviors reflected extreme psychological fixation. magnified by isolation and the compulsion embedded in the inheritance. He emphasized that the sisters' actions were deliberate, structured, and ritualized, a form of obsession that had become entirely self-contained. Local oral histories from the period preserved detailed descriptions of nighttime activity. Witnesses reported seeing Elise carry a lantern across snow and frozen ground while Catherine consulted her ledger, realigning objects in precise sequences. Observers consistently noted that these movements were coordinated, deliberate, and repeated nightly, reinforcing the perception that the hollow operated under an internal logic invisible to outsiders. These testimonies, corroborated across multiple sources, contributed to a regional reputation of unease and avoidance. Newspaper coverage remained cautious. A brief entry in the Harrison Gazette described Mill Creek Hollow as a property governed entirely by patterns known only to its occupants, resistant to observation or interruption. The report referenced the Ozark Mountains' rugged terrain and acoustic peculiarities, noting that disorientation and auditory illusions could amplify perceptions of unusual activity. Observers, it concluded, were often unable to penetrate the full extent of the sisters' behavior, leaving the estate largely insulated from intervention. By winter 1905, Mill Creek Hollow had solidified as a locus of both psychological and geographical isolation. The inheritance of Elias Morrison had become a governing force, structuring every movement, gesture, and decision. Catherine and Elise were bound by compulsion, performing precise, ritualized actions that blended the tangible, ledgers, coins, minerals, with the intangible, pattern, order, and repetition. Outsiders could only observe from a distance, recording whispers, fleeting lantern light, and the eerie cadence of steps that seemed in harmony with the hills themselves. Even as the surrounding Ozark Mountains experienced seasonal change, Mill Creek Hollow remained a place apart. The estate, the inheritance, and the sisters' obsession formed an interlocking system resistant to intervention or comprehension. The hollow had become a self-contained world, where time, space, and behavior were dictated by the legacy of Elias Morrison, leaving observers unsettled, intrigued, and unable to fully resolve the mystery that persisted in the northern Arkansas valleys. As 1906 began, the Morrison sisters' routines had reached a level of relentless precision. Intertwined with the natural rhythms of Mill Creek Hollow and the rugged Ozark terrain, Catherine's ledger work had expanded beyond cataloging objects. It included intricate records of the movement of light, shadows, and even the behavior of the wind within the hollows. Elise's tracing of patterns across floors, walls, and the snow-blanketed grounds continued with unwavering exactness. Observers later described her movements as ritualized choreography, synchronized with Catherine's ledger work yet impossible to decipher from the outside. Marshal Jonathan Clemens reports emphasized the estate's resistance to outside interference. He noted that the sisters' coordination, combined with the isolation and topographical complexity of the Ozarks, made observation challenging. Even the smallest deviation from their routines seemed to provoke immediate corrective actions, a reflection of both inherited compulsion and environmental reinforcement. Clemens wrote that, "The house itself imposes order, as if the legacy of Elias Morrison extends beyond material possessions into the very air and walls of the estate." Disappearance reports continued sporadically, further amplifying the hollow's notoriety. One hired woodsman, Caleb Turner, vanished while clearing brush near a limestone ridge. His tools were found carefully arranged, his notes left open with sketches resembling Elise's patterns. Search parties combed the surrounding hollows but encountered thick underbrush, fog, and the acoustic distortions characteristic of the Ozark valleys, leaving no trace. Witnesses still reported seeing lantern light along ridges and fleeting shadows, believed to be the sisters' nocturnal movements. These recurring patterns reinforced the notion that Mill Creek Hollow operated under its own rules, largely inaccessible to outsiders. Dr. Henry Bales, returning for observation, recorded further intensification of the sisters' behaviors. Catherine enforced strict adherence to the ledger, while Elise's attention to spatial patterns, light, and shadow appeared almost preternatural in its consistency. Bales concluded that these were not ordinary eccentricities. They were obsessive behaviors maintained and amplified by environmental isolation and the inherited structure of the estate. He noted that the sisters' world was entirely self-contained, a closed system in which deviations from internal rules provoked immediate correction and heightened focus. Local testimonies continued to describe nocturnal activities with remarkable consistency. Witnesses recalled Elise carrying a lantern across frozen yards and hollows while Catherine consulted her ledger, arranging objects with precision. The patterns were repeated nightly, coordinated yet indecipherable, leaving observers with a profound sense of unease. This consistency lent credibility to the accounts, suggesting a deliberate, ongoing practice rather than random behavior. Newspaper coverage maintained a cautious approach. A brief entry in the Harrison Gazette described the hollow as a property governed entirely by its occupant's internal system, resistant to observation or interference. The article acknowledged the amplifying effect of the Ozark terrain. Dense forests, ridges, and limestone hollows produced acoustic and visual distortions, intensifying the perception of abnormality. Observers often left the property unsettled, unable to comprehend the full extent of the sisters' routines. By the summer of 1906, Mill Creek Hollow had become a locus of quiet dread. The inheritance, environmental isolation, and obsessive routines had created a self-contained system resistant to disruption. Catherine and Elise Morrison, enmeshed in the dictates of Elias Morrison's ledgers, performed daily rituals with unwavering precision. Outsiders could only observe, speculate, and document, yet the estate, the inheritance, and the sisters' obsessive behaviors remained largely inaccessible and incomprehensible. Even as the surrounding Ozarks flourished with the seasonal cycle, Mill Creek Hollow remained suspended in its own rhythm. The sisters' routines, driven by legacy, pattern, and environmental influence, ensured that the estate operated according to an internal logic impenetrable to outsiders. The inheritance, far from being simply material, dictated the very rhythm of life, movement, and perception within the hollow, leaving a lingering, unresolved mystery in the northern Arkansas valleys. By autumn of 1906, Mill Creek Hollow had become a place of legend among the surrounding communities. The Ozark Mountains, with their dense forests and steep limestone ridges, amplified the sisters' isolation, creating conditions where sound and shadow distorted perception. Catherine and Elise Morrison remained entirely absorbed in their rituals. Catherine's ledger work extended to meticulous cataloging of the estate's natural features: soil, water flow, shadows cast by trees, while Elise traced patterns across floors, walls, and frozen ground outside, aligning them with the environmental cues noted by her sister. Observers described their behaviors as deliberate and sustained, a daily enactment of inherited compulsion. Marshal Jonathan Clemens' notes from this period emphasize both the precision of the sisters' actions and the amplifying effect of the hollow's terrain. He observed that even minor deviations from established routines prompted immediate correction, suggesting an internal system of rules rooted in the legacy of Elias Morrison. Clemens wrote, "It is as if the house and its contents, combined with the landscape, enforce order, dictating not just what is done, but how and when." The natural acoustics of hollows and ridges contributed to the eerie perception of the estate, where footsteps, whispers, and the shifting of objects seemed amplified beyond their physical source. Disappearances continued to be reported, though sporadically. One hired laborer, Nathaniel Sorrell, vanished after tending to a small section of the barn. His tools were left neatly arranged, and his journal lay open with sketches resembling Elise's patterns. Search parties combed the surrounding hollows, but thick underbrush, fog, and distorted soundscape rendered recovery impossible. Witnesses reported seeing lantern light along ridges and fleeting shadows moving in coordination with the sisters' nocturnal routines. This pattern, repeated over years, reinforced the notion that Mill Creek Hollow operated on rules impervious to outsiders. Dr. Henry Bales, returning once more, observed the intensification of obsessive behaviors. Catherine enforced strict adherence to the ledger, while Elise's movements appeared increasingly trance. like guided by light, shadow, and the arrangement of objects within the estate. Bales concluded that the sisters' behaviors were consistent with extreme psychological fixation, exacerbated by environmental isolation and the compulsive legacy of their father's estate. The hollow itself, he noted, acted almost as a container, shaping and amplifying these behaviors in a way outsiders could neither influence nor fully understand. Local oral histories reinforce these observations. Witnesses consistently reported Elise carrying a lantern across the yard or hollows while Catherine consulted the ledger, arranging objects with exacting precision. These coordinated movements were repeated nightly, creating a sense of ritual and continuity. Observers remarked that even a fleeting glimpse of the sisters' routines was profoundly unsettling, as if they were participating in a system of order entirely alien to ordinary life. Newspaper coverage maintained a cautious tone. The Harrison Gazette described the hollow as a property governed entirely by its occupants' internal system, resistant to observation or interference. The article referenced the Ozark Mountains' peculiar terrain, noting that acoustic distortions and visual anomalies could exaggerate perceived abnormality. Observers consistently left the property unsettled, recording movements, patterns, and sounds that were, in combination, impossible to fully interpret. By late 1906, Mill Creek Hollow had become a self-contained system of inheritance, obsession, and environmental reinforcement. Catherine and Elise Morrison's rituals, guided by the ledgers and intensified by the terrain, ensured that the estate remained impervious to outside understanding. Even as the surrounding Ozarks underwent seasonal change, the hollow retained its own rhythm, a world in which legacy, isolation, and obsessive behavior merged into a persistent, unresolved mystery. Whispers persisted among locals, lanterns moving at dusk, the cadence of counting across the hollows, shadows that seemed to move independently. The inheritance of Elias Morrison continued to dominate the sisters' lives, shaping every action, movement, and gesture. Mill Creek Hollow remained both a physical and psychological enclosure, a locus of pattern, obsession, and quiet dread, its mysteries unresolved in the northern Arkansas valleys. By the winter of 1906, Mill Creek Hollow had assumed a reputation that extended beyond the immediate communities of northern Arkansas. The Ozark Ridges, blanketed in snow and fog, created an environment where the estate's isolation was near total. Catherine and Elise Morrison continued their obsessive routines with relentless precision. Catherine's ledger had expanded to include not only material items, but also sequences of light, shadow, and sound within the household and surrounding grounds. Elise's pattern tracing, carried out across floors, walls, and the frozen earth, appeared increasingly trance-like, coordinated with Catherine's meticulous arrangements. Observers would later describe their movements as almost ritualistic, a choreography dictated entirely by the inheritance of Elias Morrison. Marshal Jonathan Clemens continued his oversight of the estate. His notes described the sisters' behaviors as an internal logic entirely inaccessible to outsiders, highlighting how the property's isolation and the acoustic and visual distortions of the hollows amplified the perception of their obsession. He emphasized that even minor deviations prompted immediate correction, indicating a rigid internal structure maintained across years of solitary practice. The combination of environmental complexity and inherited compulsion made the hollow effectively self-regulating, its patterns impervious to intervention. Disappearances continued sporadically. One hired woodsman, Jacob Haynes, vanished after clearing brush along a ridge. His tools were found carefully arranged, his journal left open with sketches echoing Elise's patterns. Search parties combed the hollows, but the steep ridges, dense vegetation, and fog hindered recovery. Witnesses reported faint lantern light moving across ridges, or the sudden shifting of shadows, consistent with prior accounts of the sisters' nocturnal activity. These repeated phenomena reinforced the perception that the hollow operated under its own rules, largely inaccessible to outsiders. Dr. Henry Bales, returning to the estate, documented the intensification of behaviors. Catherine's attention to her ledger became obsessive, while Elise's pattern tracing incorporated subtle cues from environmental light and shadow. Bales concluded that these were not ordinary eccentricities, but behaviors resulting from extreme psychological fixation, reinforced by the isolation and compulsive framework embedded in Elias Morrison's inheritance. His notes emphasized that the estate functioned as a closed system, with the sisters' actions entirely governed by their internal logic. Local testimonies continued to describe the sisters' nocturnal routines. Witnesses reported seeing Elise carry a lantern across frozen yards or hollows while Catherine consulted her ledger, realigning objects in precise sequences. Observers consistently noted that these movements were coordinated, deliberate, and repeated nightly, suggesting a deliberate and ongoing practice rather than randomness. This consistency lent credibility to local folklore describing Mill Creek Hollow as a locus of quiet, persistent obsession. Newspaper coverage remained cautious, highlighting verifiable details without speculation. A brief entry in the Harrison Gazette described the hollow as a property governed by its occupant's internal system, resistant to observation or interference. The article referenced the Ozark Mountains' unique terrain, noting that acoustic and visual distortions could intensify perceptions of abnormality, making observers feel disoriented and unsettled. Even those tasked with monitoring the hollow left with incomplete understanding of the sisters' behaviors. By early 1907, Mill Creek Hollow had become a self-contained system where inheritance, isolation, and obsessive routine converged. Catherine and Elise Morrison, bound by Elias Morrison's ledgers, performed daily rituals with unwavering precision. The estate, the environmental distortions of the Ozarks, and the sisters' inherited compulsions created a world largely inaccessible to outsiders. Paths remained deserted, livestock kept distant, and travelers spoke in hushed tones of the hollow where counting, alignment, and repetition governed every movement. Whispers persisted, lanterns moving along ridges at dusk, faint counting echoing through hollows, shadows behaving unnaturally. The inheritance remained the controlling force, guiding every action and ensuring that Mill Creek Hollow existed as both a physical and psychological enclosure, a locus of obsession, pattern, and unresolved mystery within the northern Arkansas valleys. By the spring of 1907, Mill Creek Hollow had settled into a rhythm that seemed entirely removed from the world, beyond its ridges. Catherine and Elise Morrison were inseparable from their inheritance, their daily lives dictated by the ledgers, chests, and cryptic instructions left by Elias Morrison. Catherine meticulously recorded sequences of objects, soil, and crystal fragments, while Elise traced intricate patterns across floors, walls, and the surrounding ground. Observers, when they ventured near the estate, described the sisters' movements as deliberate, synchronized, and almost ritualistic, a choreography entirely invisible to outsiders. Marshal Jonathan Clemens' final reports on the hollow emphasized the insurmountable isolation and the estate's self-contained nature. He wrote that even with repeated attempts at observation, the sisters' behaviors remained largely impervious to interference. The hollow's topography, dense forests, limestone ridges, and steep valleys, distorted sound and shadow, amplifying the perception of uncanny order. The estate enforces its own structure, Clemens noted, pattern dictated by inheritance, isolation, and the will of its occupants, rendered invisible to those who do not live within it. Disappearances continued to shadow the estate, though records became sporadic. The pattern remained: workers or visitors vanished without trace, their tools and personal effects left arranged with deliberate precision. Search parties were confounded by the terrain and the hollow's deceptive acoustics. Local testimonies recounted the flicker of lanterns on ridgelines, the cadence of footsteps in the fog, and shadows that appeared to move independently of the sisters' known paths. These accounts persisted as both folklore and semi-documented observation, blurring the line between tangible fact and narrative speculation. Dr. Henry Bale's final notes on the sisters provide the clearest insight into their state. He observed that Catherine's devotion to the ledger and Elise's pattern tracing were not merely eccentricities but compulsions reinforced by environmental isolation and the demands of the inherited system. He concluded that the estate functioned as a contained mechanism. Every object, gesture, and sequence was governed by the legacy of Elias Morrison. Their world, he wrote, was a closed system of inherited obsession, environmental reinforcement, and ritualized behavior, inaccessible to outside understanding. Oral histories and affidavits from the period preserved the sisters' nocturnal routines. Witnesses described Elise carrying a lantern through frozen hollows while Catherine consulted her ledger, arranging objects with exacting precision. These coordinated behaviors, repeated nightly, lent continuity to folklore describing the hollow as a place of quiet dread. Observers consistently reported a sense of unease, noting that the estate operated under a logic entirely its own, one amplified by the distortions of the Ozark terrain. Newspaper coverage remained restrained. The Harrison Gazette characterized the estate as a property governed by an internal system, resistant to observation or interference. The article acknowledged the influence of the Ozarks' geography, noting that the landscape, dense forest, ridges, and limestone hollows, produced acoustic and visual anomalies that magnified the perception of strange behavior. Even experienced marshals and researchers left unsettled, their reports incomplete and fragmented. By late 1907, Mill Creek Hollow had become a self-contained world of inheritance, obsession, and environmental amplification. Catherine and Elise Morrison's lives were inseparable from the routines dictated by Elias Morrison's ledgers. The estate, the landscape, and the rituals maintained a closed system in which outsiders could observe, speculate, and document, but never intervene or fully understand. Today, whispers persist among locals, lanterns flicker along ridges at dusk, shadows move in the hollows, and faint counting drifts through the forests. Mill Creek Hollow remains an unresolved echo of the inheritance that shaped the Morrison sisters' lives, a silent testament to how environment, legacy, and obsession can intertwine to create a world apart. The mystery endures in the northern Arkansas valleys, untouched and impenetrable, a case file